Okay. All right. We're talking today with Mr. Richard Dorsey of Belmont, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project, with a little bit of occasional background noise from the guys with the drills next door. Fortunately, the mics leave most of that out. Okay. Mr. Dorsey, can you start by giving us a little bit of background on yourself? To begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in 1946 in Gary, Indiana.
Okay. What did your family do for a living in those days?
My father and mother were both teachers, and especially in the music area.
Okay. And did you grow up in Gary, or did you move somewhere else?
Yes, I did. I grew up in Gary and actually was drafted from that location.
Okay. And did you go to public schools or private ones, or?
Public schools.
Okay. Now, what kind of place was Gary, Indiana, say in the late 50s, early 60s?
Oh, it was a thriving small metropolis. Of course, the center of its industry was steel industry, which was a booming thing at that time. Gary was a very cultural, active community, and certainly vibrant with employment and people making money, especially those that weren't skilled.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, it was also a place which, at least by the late 60s, had seen its share of racial problems and other issues. Was there much of that going on before you left, or were you aware of much of that?
Oh, there was a racial divide, but I did not get exposed to that to any extent.
Mm-hmm. The high school that you go to, was that mostly white kids, or was it mixed?
Yes, it was.
Okay. All right. Now, when did you receive your draft notice?
Actually, I had, after I left high school, I went and played around with college for a little bit. It just wasn't the right time for me. And actually tried to join the Air Force, and they said I had a bad knee, so I couldn't. And 6 months later, when I was about 20 years old, the draft sought me out and said my knee was fine. And I was drafted at that time in 1968.
All right. Had you been working then, or doing other things?
Yeah, at the time, as a matter of fact, I was a lifeguard for the YMCA, as I recall.
All right. Now, what did you know about the Vietnam War before you were drafted?
I was somewhat naive about the Vietnam War. I knew it was going on, and the spin on it from the circles I ran in was that it was good, that it was taking care of communist aggression and all that. So it was all the right twist at that time, again, with the circles I ran in.
Mm-hmm. And for the most part, at least through '67, an awful lot of the news coverage was still fairly positive. We were winning, or
right, exactly. And probably the time I was drafted, the war was really escalating. But of course, the spin on it was that we were doing great things and having great wins of battles and such as that.
Okay. Now, did you have relatives who had been in the service, or did you not know much about that kind of thing?
My father was in the Navy, brother was in the Air Force, another brother was in the Army.
Okay. So on some level, going into the service was a fairly normal thing to do?
A fairly normal thing to do. Again, in the circles I ran in, it was a noble thing to do. Once the country called, you responded. And insofar as the political climate, especially around Vietnam, I was oblivious to anything.
Right. Okay. Now, where did they send you then for basic training?
Fort Bliss, Texas. Initially went down to Kentucky, but they didn't have enough room. As I said, the war was escalating. They were trying to draft a lot more people, and so they had to send me to Fort Bliss, Texas for my basic training.
Okay. And where in Texas is Fort Bliss?
Close to the Mexican border. About in the central part of the state.
Is it near El Paso, or is it?
Yes, exactly.
That's kind of off on one end there.
Oh, is that what it is? Okay,
I think so.
That's my naivety. I thought it was the middle of the state.
Okay. All right. And how would you describe the facility when you got there?
Oh, very, very nice, very clean. It was a good experience, other than the bad connotations of basic training. It was a very clean facility.
Okay. Now, was the facility, did it have new buildings and things like that, or was it?
I would say relatively new.
Okay. So you weren't just stuck in old World War II vintage barracks or things like
Exactly,
that?
exactly.
Okay. Now, what kind of reception did you get when you arrived down at Fort Bliss?
Oh, they were so glad to see me. It was a typical scenario where the drill sergeant, as soon as you get off the bus, starts barking at you the whole shot, and all designed to break your previous mental position and be receptive to what they had in store for you. I can look back and see that.
Right. Now, how well or quickly did you adjust to that?
Well, it was a blur, to be honest with you. At the very start, I did not expect to be drafted in the first place because I just got rejected from the Air Force. But it was a bit of a blur, and of course, literally, you would run through lines to get shots and other things, almost like a bunch of cattle, and it very impersonal.
But you just kind of, as far as you can tell, you just kind of went along with it?
Just went along and adjusted to it, and finally got my arms wrapped around it a little bit
All
to an
right.
extent.
Now, aside from simply learning the discipline and following orders, what else did basic consist of when you were in it?
What else did basic
Yeah.
consist of? Discipline, again, breaking. I personally didn't have a lot of baggage to bring in, but some did. And the program that they had was very adept at getting everybody in the same mold. For the most part, where they were receptive to the training. Horrible schedules where you get to bed late at night, early in the morning. The drill sergeants were ridiculous of what they expected and what they inspected. The training was very demanding. I remember just being constantly tired all the time. We would have to go places in cattle trucks, literally standing up rather than nice buses and all that. They had a lot to do in a little bit of time to get us ready for Vietnam is what it was, and so they put you through the mill.
All right. And then did you get weapons training along with that?
Yes, some basic weapons training in there. It became more advanced in my advanced infantry training from there at the next assignment.
Okay. Now, from the beginning, were you using M16s and the modern weapons, or did you have older ones?
No, primarily the M14s at that stage.
All right. And did they have you do a lot of physical training, a lot of marching and hiking and
Oh,
things like
marching, hiking, a lot of physical conditioning, and all again for a purpose. But and that was very demanding as well. I remember that. Now that you bring it up.
that? Okay. Now, were you in reasonably good shape when you started, or did you have to get in shape?
Actually, I was being a lifeguard at the YMCA. Put me in incredible shape because between classes, I didn't have anything to do, so I swam a lot. And that exercise really prepared me much more than I realized for that time. Really
Okay.
did.
Now, what kind of people were you training alongside? How old were they? Where were they from?
Pretty close to my age, maybe a year younger, maybe a year older. From the Gary area, the Chicago area, Northwest Indiana area, that sort of thing, a bit of Chicago.
Okay, so it was a specific group recruited out of a particular region and brought down at least to train together at that
Correct,
stage.
correct.
Okay. Now, how long did the basic training last?
8 weeks.
Okay. And then you move on to the advanced training after that. Did you stay at Fort Bliss or go somewhere else?
Went someplace else. And that was, I was assigned to the infantry. That was my, I guess they called MOS, if I recall right. And so I went to Fort Polk, Louisiana for advanced infantry training.
Okay. Now, how was Fort Polk any different from Fort Bliss? Or?
Much older facility, much older barracks. it was, I'm sure, designed to replicate what would be facing in Vietnam because there were a lot of swampy conditions, humid conditions, and topography was very similar to what we encountered then ultimately in Vietnam.
Okay. Now describe a little bit the actual training program.
Well, of course, it continued to be intensive, but of course, as I recall, and I'm sure there's a lot that I've forgotten about, but certainly the advanced weapons mechanics, and that not only retained the M14 and all that surrounds that, but the machine gun, got intensive training on that, and also the M16 and then the 45 caliber pistol. So we got much more intensive training on those things, on tactics, on evading the enemy if we were separated from our group in Vietnam, and how you did that, survival training, that sort of thing, as I recall. Very, very interesting scenarios with taking a chicken and taking it from catching it all the way to cooking and eating it, which wasn't real appetizing.
Okay. Now, were your instructors at that point people who had been to Vietnam?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And how much did they tell you, or what kinds of things did they tell you to expect?
They didn't say a whole lot other than the fact that she knew that you were tentatively facing a serious situation, and they meant business, is what it amounted to.
Mm-hmm. All right. And now, was AIT, was that another 8 weeks or longer than that?
That was another 8 weeks, that's correct.
All right. And then what happens when you finish that?
Then I got a brief respite, and then was shipped over to Vietnam.
All right. How did
Which
they...
would have been probably June, and I don't know. I think the time was about right. Yeah, if my math is right, that would put me just past the 8 weeks, a little time for saying goodbye to the family and then shipping out.
So about June of '68, or pretty close to that.
Right.
Okay. How did they get you physically to Vietnam?
Had to report to Chicago, where they flew me to Washington, state of Washington, and there received my orders of how I was to be flown out and what group I was to be with. And I cannot recall, it was certainly a safe area. We flew to Japan first for refueling, and then on to Vietnam, and it certainly was a safe area that I came into, and I cannot recall the name of the city.
So you don't know whether you went in, because some people flew to the Saigon area, some flew to Da Nang, some flew to Cam Ranh Bay.
Cam Ranh Bay sounds very familiar to me.
And that may actually have been the safest option.
Right.
Now, did they fly you in a commercial jet or a military one?
Commercial jet, yes.
Okay. Now, was it all soldiers on that plane, or were there civilians?
I'm sorry?
Was it all soldiers on the plane, or?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it was all soldiers and very few amenities.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, what was your first impression of Vietnam when you got off the plane?
First impression of Vietnam, of course, landing in a safe area, and the area that I landed in was not a jungle area. It was much more open at that point. And again, it was like a blur, because as soon as you landed, you were shuffled through a number of stations and then finally carted out by helicopter to where you were to be assigned. So it was a quick blur, as well as I remember.
All right. Do you remember it being hot, or?
Very hot.
Okay. And was there any kind of distinctive smell in the place where you got off? Or does that come elsewhere?
Interesting. Not there, not that I recall. There were other smells later on in the year that I'll never forget, but not there.
Okay. You're kind of away from a lot of the agricultural zones and some of the other ones that got interesting. Okay. So you basically get up, and they're whisking you off in different directions. basically, kind of follow us through that process. You get off the plane, they take you off the runway. Do you stay in that area for a while to get assigned?
For just a couple of days until they could process uh, your specific orders and then be assigned to a specific unit. If I recall right, it was relatively quick, a relatively short time there in Cameron Bay before I was put on a larger helicopter and taken up to the DMZ is where I was assigned initially.
All right. And what unit were you assigned to?
The first Air Cav, the second of the 7th, it was called the Gary Owen Division. Unfortunately, after George Custer, who lost everything in his battle, but that's what it was.
Okay, yeah, so 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division, right. And the 1st Cav had...
It was 2nd Cav. Oh, no, I'm sorry, 1st Air Cav, 2nd, yeah.
2nd Brigade,
yeah.
They did, there are a lot of different numbers they juggled around, because they would take battalions from different regiments and brigade them together within the division.
I think you probably know better than I do.
Yeah, that's the military organization thing, but initially, okay, but you're with 7th Cav, and that sticks with you at that point. I think your discharge papers list you at some point with the 8th Cavalry. Did you
No,
switch
it
units, or-
wasn't the 8th Cavalry, but it must have been the 8th Brigade or even some other distinctive group, but
Right.
it was always 2nd of the 7th.
Okay.
Yes.
You were with them. All right. Now, what condition was the unit in, as far as you can tell, when you joined it? Had they taken a lot of casualties, or were they pretty close to
No,
full strength?
when I joined it, it seemed relatively docile in the sense that they weren't anxious about enemy fire upon them or being attacked or whatever. It was just the unknown at the time of what was I walking into, and sensing that it wasn't a big deal where I walked into.
Okay. Now, you were joining the unit basically as an individual. So the unit's already there, and you're joining them in the field. Now, were there a lot of you going to join them all at the same time, or just a couple?
There were 2 of us, as I recall, going to join that unit on that day that I was assigned to that particular group.
Okay. And so are you assigned to a particular platoon and squad, so you get introduced to a certain group of men at that point?
Right, and it turned out, as I understand, we were replacing people that were being sent back home, and so the 2 of us actually almost got to the same squad at of the bigger unit.
Right.
Very interesting.
Okay. And what impression did you have of the men in the unit? I mean, you said they didn't seem to be too concerned about what was going on.
Well, for the most part, somewhat impersonal, like, okay, here's some new green troops coming in, and I haven't got time for you right now, that sort of thing. And not that they were bad, but they just didn't go out of their way to welcome you
Okay.
too much.
Physically, what were the conditions like where you were? How would you describe the area? And
The area was quite open, not mountains, but hills, small hills, but a lot of flat land, and somewhat dry and, of course, warm.
okay. And what were your living conditions? Were you just sleeping out in the open, or?
Living conditions. That was my biggest shock initially, was living conditions, because when you first got supplies to get to your assignment, you were given some basic things, one of which was an air mattress. Well, an air mattress is like gold. Okay, it just wasn't seen by many people. And I also had a poncho that served as half of a tent that I put with another person. And we slept in that, underneath those ponchos that served as a tent wherever we were, because we were not in an area that had buildings. We were out in the field.
Now, were you dug in? Did you have foxholes or bunkers or things like that?
where we were, we had foxholes, not all the time. Uh, Sometimes we were so transient we didn't have time to dig them. And further, the necessity for them was very minimal because, by and large, unless we stayed in a place for several days, then we would dig foxholes. But by and large, we weren't attacked by anybody up there. They had already seen a lot of the trouble, and the area had been somewhat secured, so you ran into booby traps and a few snipers that were probably kids, and that was it.
Okay. Now, what were sort of the daily activities up there while you were by the DMZ?
Oh, daily activities. As strange as it sounds, something they didn't teach you in training, in basic or advanced infantry training, is how you go to the bathroom out in the field. And now that sounds rather silly, but I remember the first time I thought, what do I do? And so I went outside the perimeter and did my little thing, and I remember a helicopter coming over my head and thought, I wish they'd go away. And then very quickly you adjusted and became a part of the landscape, and all of your functions then meshed with the environment that you were in, at least for me.
Okay. Now, were you not supposed to go outside the perimeter?
Well, you were supposed to do it at restricted times and in certain areas because you would typically have an outpost beyond the perimeter, so you stay between the outpost and the perimeter as long as there wasn't any danger, imminent danger.
But they hadn't created any other kind of facilities for you? Like they
No,
had
I
in some
mean, you
bases?
took your shovel and you dug a trench and straddled it, and that was it.
All right.
I hope that's not too graphic.
No, well, that's fine. Well, because in some of the places there were sort of the fortified camps and things like that. They had other sorts of systems or latrines.
Where
or
I
things like
was,
that.
they did not even have outhouses.
Right.
It was very rustic.
Right. Now, did you do a lot of patrolling, or did you just stay in?
Oh, sure. We did patrolling as squads, very limited basis, but we did routine patrolling, but ran into very little resistance in that area.
Okay. And what impression did you have of sort of the leadership of the unit? I mean, the sergeants or lieutenants or things like that.
The leadership, you were very detached from the lieutenant and the captain, at least at my level you were. And by and large, people were somewhat impersonal, although they grew more personal and warm to you the longer you stuck around and became one of the group that was watching each other's back, so to speak.
About how long did that process take, do you think?
Probably a month.
Okay.
For me, anyhow.
All right. So you have that adjustment process while you're still up in the DMZ area. Now, about how long did you stay in that sector?
About 4 months.
Okay. And did the circumstances stay pretty much the same the whole time?
Yeah, absolutely. Other than probably the biggest challenge was the monsoons coming in and dealing with that. And that was harder, although there were incidents with booby traps where men were killed with them. They were few and far between.
Mm-hmm. Now, were the booby traps in the forms of sort of basically mines or other?
Yes.
Yeah, so explosive
absolutely.
things at different places.
Mines in the ground, or the type that would jump up and explode up in the air just above head height, that sort of thing.
Yeah. All right. Now, eventually you get news that you're moving out and going somewhere else.
Yes.
All right. Where do you go next?
They put us in helicopters, sent us down near Saigon. I think it was in Da Nang, as a matter of fact. And then we regrouped there, and they very quickly, we weren't there very long, quickly flew us en masse with a number of Huey helicopters out to what was called a virgin territory. Virgin insofar as no GIs had ever been, out west of Saigon on the Cambodian border.
All right. Now, was there a landing zone cleared for you, or was it open country, or?
It wasn't real open. The landing zone had not been cleared. We established the landing zone and created it from day one.
All right. Now, was this sort of a new experience for you to fly into enemy territory like that? Or had you been going places in helicopters before that?
To a small degree, you had a little bit of that experience up north, but when you flew into the unit that was out in the field, it was pretty well secured.
Right.
When we flew in down south, it was like your eyes opened up and like, okay, what am I walking into? Now, fortunately, it's not what they call a hot LZ situation where we flew into all sorts of enemy resistance. It was for whatever reason we received no resistance.
Right. So in this case, they didn't quite know you were coming. Or,
Apparently not.
Or if they did, they weren't opposing you.
Right.
Okay. So now basically what you get there, and now was the whole battalion going together, or a company, or a squad, or did you have any sense?
That was primarily a company
Okay.
that went into that particular area.
All right. And then once you landed, what did you do?
Then it was a matter of securing the area, making sure before anything was done that we got some outposts outside of the perimeter we were trying to establish by virtue of digging foxholes and creating an area we would operate patrols out of in order to see if the area was clear or if we were going to start to face resistance. Of course, I also ultimately found out we were close to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and there was a design to start to see or intercept some of the traffic coming down through that trail. Yeah, when we landed, we immediately got some people out. Once we realized that we weren't getting resistance, we got a few people stationed in strategic areas, and then proceeded to dig the foxholes and have the little hooches that made out of ponchos and all that in order to start to create a stable environment out of which to operate.
Right. Now, did you have things like concertina wire or mines or things like that as well?
We didn't have concertina wire, but we did, after we established a little more stability within the camp, we almost at the same time, we were putting out claymore mines and things like that for preventive measures.
Right. Now, how long did it take for you to start to attract the enemy's attention?
Very quickly, as a matter of fact, as it turned out, and it was our squad that I was assigned to that had the first confrontation.
And what happened at that point?
Well, when they finally started to send out patrols after things were established, our group was the first one assigned to a patrol headed by a very green lieutenant. Well, again, I didn't find out until later. He took us out, but he got lost, and we went further than we were supposed to go. Consequently, when he finally realized where we were and where we had to go to get back to the landing zone, as we started to walk back, we walked right into a major regiment of North Vietnamese, not just Viet Cong, that was pretty well entrenched, and I'm sure we were surprised because I don't think they expected us to be quite out where we were so soon.
All right. Now, so basically, once you bump into them, did you just try to get away from them, or what were you doing?
We couldn't. We were absolutely pinned down flat with fire. I would say as close, frankly, to this blue wall. Very thick jungle was his topography. And I remember not being able to see it. And what is that, 20 feet, 25 feet?
Yeah. If that.
I remember not being able to see anything, but the fire was so intense and so low, we couldn't even be in a sitting position. We had to be prone on the ground. That being our first real conflict, nobody knew what to do, frankly, of our unit. And unfortunately, the lieutenant didn't either. He was more scared than we were, and he was in the back of the whole patrol. So we were stuck initially. Then all of a sudden, It's very interesting. It, even with the lack of direction by this lieutenant, all of a sudden everybody started to regroup within themselves, and then we started to act as a unit, putting into force all the training that we had. It was more mechanical than anything. And so we started to strategically plant machine gunners and spread out as much as possible, even though most of it was crawling, to protect ourselves. I do remember that.
All right. And then how did that situation resolve itself then?
Well, I remember when we first ran into them, our point man, and it's interesting, the point man was the guy I came into the country with. He got the point job and I got the grenadier job. Those are the two most hated jobs. Grenadier because of all the weight of all the bigger ammunition,
Right.
and point man naturally because you put yourself in danger. And he was shot immediately in the chest. I remember being on the left flank, totally pinned down and not knowing what was going on. At one point, I remembered a projectile coming up over the canopy, and I looked at it kind of strangely. I thought, what is that? Well, all of a sudden hit me. It was an enemy grenade, and it actually rolled towards me. Well, the enemy had cut down trees to build the bunkers. And right next to me was a stump, maybe, 3 feet high. And instinctively, I rolled over behind the stump. The grenade rolled on the other side, blew up, and of course, nothing happened with me, other than I knew I was scared to death. And at that time, we finally realized that the company commander, who was a captain, was coming out from the landing zone to help us. The problem was the enemy was between us and him. He didn't know it. He got shot and killed immediately. His radio operator got shot and killed immediately, and several others were killed or wounded in that group. So they couldn't help us anymore. This was, as I found out later, of course, it was a crack North Vietnamese group. And so it turned out that the man that was to replace our killed company commander happened to be flying in to go to another unit on a helicopter. He heard on the radio what was going on and proceeded with his helicopter sitting quite a bit above us, took and led us out back away from the enemy, because we didn't know where the enemy was and who was what. Of course, the lieutenant had no idea where we were.
But
Not really.
But he's got a radio operator with him who can talk to the helicopter?
That's correct. And that radio operator talked with this captain that was coming in for another unit, was pulled back out, and then we took a really roundabout way, almost even in the dark at the last, to get back to the landing zone. And we were guided by this helicopter because he could see whether it was probable, safe way to go. And the enemy, for whatever reason, did not want to engage us anymore. And they, as soon as we started to back off and the other rescuing group started to retreat as well, then they let us go because either they were too small. I was told they were quite large, but either too small or not ready to attack. I don't know what the problem was on their part, but we eventually made it back to the landing zone.
Okay. Now, while you were out there, did you have any kind of artillery or air support?
None.
Okay.
No artillery, no air.
All right. Because often, I guess, once the Americans knew where a large formation was, then they would bring all of that in.
There were other skirmishes later that we had that, but the problem was there were so many of the GIs close to the enemy, they couldn't fire the artillery, and the air support, I don't remember even planes coming overhead on that one. And of course the attack initially was so small that they probably didn't focus on that as a priority,
Right.
to send the planes out.
Right. But a larger enemy unit, once it has been spotted, becomes a target at a certain
Absolutely.
point. And then once you pull away, then they know that. They may know that.
Absolutely.
In any case, well, that's certainly a pretty dramatic initiation there all at once. What Do you remember at all what you felt like after you'd gotten back out?
Somewhat shaken a bit. However, it's interesting. I think it put a resolve in all the group and stepped us up a couple levels above where we were. Because all of a sudden, we got ready. We knew we were in something serious. And it wasn't like the little booby traps and once in a while sniper up north where your guard really wasn't up. Here, all of a sudden, all your training came back to focus on, okay, now let's do what we need to do. And if I may add, it turns out that captain that was flying in for another unit knew the captain that was killed and asked to be reassigned to our unit, which he was. And he then took over the reins, and I'll perhaps talk about it later, his leadership is what really helped us in our resolve, in our organization, everything. He was a crack officer.
All right. Do you have a sense of how old he was at the time?
Probably about 6 years older than me, probably about 26, I believe.
Yeah. And at that time, he would have seemed to you maybe as kind of, an older guy or
Older
veteran.
guy, and I hated him from the start. He was the father that was very dictatorial, and you do this and you do this, and I don't want any feedback, and you didn't understand the whys and wherefores. It was just you were to do what he said and accept it for face value without any understanding. And so you grew quickly to dislike him because of that.
All right. So now, after that first incident, were you pretty regularly in contact with the enemy, or did you have longer periods of lulls, or what were you doing, basically?
Had pretty regular contact with the enemy from that point forward. There were several other landing zones throughout the time that I was in Vietnam that we created, and for various purposes all along the Cambodian border. But we started running pretty steady into other problems. Let me back up. And I forget which is larger, the brigade or a battalion. Probably the
Brigade is larger.
Okay, then the battalion. It was the battalion that established this landing zone, not the company. And there were 4 companies within this landing zone.
Right.
Okay, that's coming back to me, so forgive me
Okay,
for
fine.
that. And by and large, what turned out, and I'm getting far ahead, but certainly we'll come back to various questions you have. We, as a company, I was in B Company, Bravo Company, very seldom had the first attack of all the companies. We were primarily, until later on, the company that was saving the other companies. And it became aware to me as I became more seasoned and certainly more mature with understanding after I left Vietnam that this commander that I really disliked was really going solely by the book. He was very sharp, very smart, very wise, and his strategies and methodologies were so sharp. I think the enemy recognized that. They knew better than to try and attack him. The other companies were sloppy, and they were constantly getting attacked, and we would have to go out and rescue them. So, but it was a constant thing. And I mean, the other companies, while we had our injuries, not too many deaths in our company, the other companies had a lot of deaths and a lot of injuries, and constantly had to get replaced from that. So.
Now, was your company essentially sent on the same kinds of assignments and missions as the other ones?
Yes, we were.
Okay.
Yes, we were. The same patrols, the same occasional search and destroy missions and all that. We had the same orders, marching orders, as the other companies, as they went out in different geographic areas.
Right.
And again, we found out later, we were right by the enemy. We discovered that later, but we were not attacked.
Okay. So in this case, it wasn't as if you were being held back by the battalion commander to be the fire brigade. You just happened to be the one that was in condition to help when they needed help.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Did you see evidence of sort of developed enemy emplacements in the areas? Did they have did they have tunnels, caves, underground bunkers, things like that, or were they moving around?
Oh, yes. Fortunately, I was too big to be the tunnel rat, so to speak. I think that's what they called him, the person that would investigate the tunnels when we discovered them. And they were frequent, as well as some of the bunker complexes, much of the time vacated. But there were evidences, although there wasn't any garbage or any other evidence, it was just stumbling across these things. They were very clean with what they did. I'm talking about either the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese troops.
All right, so there were a lot of them around. Now, how did you go about trying to find the enemy? If you're doing a search and destroy mission or something like that, how does that seem to work?
Well, methodically, as I recall, we would have short patrols shortly after establishing a landing zone, short patrols, and then gradually widening the patrols, or a dedicated sweep through an area that was suspected enemy territory or a trail that they used a lot.
Okay. When you were doing these things, did they do any artillery or air preparation or bombardment, or did you go in first?
Yes, frequently. We had artillery on some occasions. We had the fighters that would come over with 500-pound bombs and drop them just over our head onto the enemy that was attacking our established positions. And probably, and this may be off, I can recall over in my time there some B-52 bomb strikes that were very, very close to us when there was an obviously very large force out there to deal with.
Okay. Now, when the B-52s hit, I mean, could you feel that where you were?
Oh my! It was incredible. You could never see the B-52s unless you really strained, and then of course you had orders to stay still because they had some navigation, which I didn't know at the time, to know where to drop the bombs. They were incredibly accurate, but they were so close to us that literally I would go a couple feet off the ground with the explosions. That was just a couple of times it was that close. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't every time they dropped them. But I remember a couple were very close situations that huge encampments that they had to do that.
All right. Now, did the landing zones themselves come under attack, either with mortar fire or rockets or sappers or anything else?
It came under attack from those things, plus being assaulted by the enemy.
All right. And do you remember any specific incidents out of those attacks or certain characteristics of them that stick with you?
Well, I just remember when the first incoming of any nature came into the camp. It wasn't always followed by an attack by the enemy themselves, but you would dive into your foxhole and hope for the best. And fortunately, most of the time, those attacks of the mortars and such were caused minimal physical damage to the men. Probably the best recollection I have of being assaulted, although they never fully breached the perimeter. Mm-hmm. I remember that the enemy troops were so high, I believe on marijuana, that you would almost cut out their legs from under them. They would start crawling towards you until you finally killed them. Just an incredible That's probably the most significant thing. Of course, the next day you go out and there are dead enemy bodies all over, and you do what clearing and what collection of things for intelligence and all that you need to. But very interesting situation.
Okay. So what opinion did you have of these people who were doing this to you?
Oh, we had gained such an intense dislike for these people. They were not only not good, but they were sneaky. They were doing things for the wrong reasons. They were the pure enemy and out to do you in. And of course, that was the ultimate, is preservation of yourself.
Sure.
Besides the bigger political scene that was involved.
Did you have a certain sort of respect for them? Anybody willing to do that much or go that far to get rid of you? Or did you not really think of it in those terms?
Actually, I had some respect, on one hand, for many of the attacks that we had, for what they went through, but I still hated them.
Sure.
All right? It's a strange dichotomy there. And other times, they were no better than a dog. I can remember frequently it was very calm out. Of course, it was very humid, very hot. We would be sitting in the landing zone, and a thick jungle area, and it was a distinctive marijuana smell. It's a funny thing. My son still doesn't believe me to this day. I've never had one marijuana smoke. I'm not saying good for me or anything like that. I just didn't.
Right.
Because I was so concerned in Vietnam of having my wits about me, I didn't want anything affecting me. It wasn't a noble thing at all. It's just self-preservation. And but there was something so distinctive about the marijuana smell, and it just floated through the air. And that usually preceded the attacks the next day. That was at night that we would sense that. And then we would be hit the next day. A couple times we were hit at night, but not very often.
All right. You're mentioning you got, the enemy is using marijuana and so forth. Did people out in the field, American soldiers, were they doing much by way of using drugs, or was that not?
Yeah, some of them were. We had access. The villagers would come out and find us. Even though we didn't see the villagers would find us, especially when we were closer in our deployment to the villages. They would come out, and we would never be under attack then. They come out and dress their kids up all sorts of great ways and so on and so forth, and they would offer a lot to us. Many of the soldiers could not deal with things, and they took them up on it and bought whatever they could of the drugs that they could take.
Now, was there enough of that sort of thing to cause problems within the units?
If there was, I was never aware of it. It was pretty much kept under wraps, either ignored or the ones using it were careful how they used it.
Okay. So it wasn't as if a unit would sort of not function at a moment of crisis or when it needed to because too many
it's a funny thing too. As I recall, most of the time, the group I was with were never under that influence. And again, I don't know why, but we just weren't. And I suspect that the others have been through so much garbage with the initial confrontations with the enemy, they had to do it just to maintain their sanity. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Now, another issue that sort of comes up a lot with units in Vietnam is just sort of racial or ethnic issues. What kind of mix of people did you have in your platoon?
Kind of mix of people, I would put it at probably 75% Caucasian and 25% African American.
And did the different groups mostly keep to themselves, or?
Absolutely. When it was relaxing time or downtime, the blacks were off by themselves, the whites were off by themselves, and even those groups were even had other splits
right.
too. But by and large, the blacks had the attitude in our unit that they weren't going to extend themselves for anything, to endanger themselves, but they would obey the rules, and we tolerated each other until it came to a skirmish, then all of a sudden there was no color. It's the funniest thing. It was distinctive, Jim, absolutely distinctive, that once the fighting started and all of us, black and white, were drawn into the battle, you would have some black and some white that would be chicken and hide in the foxhole behind us of the enemy's foxhole, bunker,
Right.
the enemy behind us. There wasn't a distinction between black and white. And there were some black and white up on the front line of the assault. So it wasn't a color thing, it was an individual thing.
Right.
But the ones that were really fighting, you had no concern about the guy in SG, regardless of his color, doing what he had to help you out, or vice versa.
All right.
Strange thing.
Now, did you spend sort of pretty much the rest of your time in Vietnam in this particular sector, in this
Yes.
Fishhook area?
Yes.
All right.
Primarily because it became such a hot area, it was recognized as a critical encampment and place a trail, primary trail, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, of which you would get a lot of side trails off and establishment of many enemy troops.
Right. Okay. Now, how long were you actually out there? Were you out there? Did you spend the full year in Vietnam, or did you leave
I
early?
spent 1 year in Vietnam, the whole year in the field.
Okay. So you're there in that sector the better part of 8 months or something like that?
That's
then?
correct.
Okay. And now, over the course of that time, did you have a lot of turnover in personnel? Were men going in and out or being wounded? And
The biggest turnover of personnel we had was because of wounded or killed in action. You had some ready to leave because they'd finished their year, but that was a small percentage, Jim. To be honest, most did not see their full year for one reason or another.
right,
At least with the group I was with.
right. Okay. But basically, but if people were in on their own sort of calendars or whatever, they'd come in at different times and then leave at different times.
Yes.
So over the course of the year, most of your unit would have turned over
Yes.
while you were there.
Yeah. By virtue of the calendar, most of the unit would have turned over, but it turned over 2 to 3 times within that year.
Right.
Although some, that was a bigger perspective.
Okay. So now in that process, do you kind of move up in rank and seniority? Did you get promoted or get assignments beyond just being a rifleman?
Yes, I did. I actually became a radio operator. I was taught to do that on a squad level finally. I was a grenadier, then a rifleman, and then became the radio operator. And I liked that because it kept me, I was in the middle of more of the action of knowing what was going on, I'm talking about. And by virtue of knowing what was going on, you had to sometimes more frequently be up near the front of the action with your boss to determine what was going on, what was needed, so on and so forth. But I liked that. And I remember the radio operator for the whole company, not just the platoon, but the company, had finished his year and was going home, and they pulled me up from squad level to company level, which surprised me. I didn't know why, but obviously I was able to do some things that they were comfortable with. And so I came alongside this captain I didn't like and actually started to be his radio operator for him and over the other operators in the company.
Now, by the time you became his radio operator, had you developed a certain respect for him yet, or was he just still a guy you didn't like?
Much more. By virtue of being intimately in everything, by virtue of communicating while we were on patrol through the radio, or even being part of strategy with the key sergeants in the rest of the platoons and squads, I became much more knowledgeable of what was going on and really started to really gain more respect for his presence, his knowledge, his wisdom, the whole shot.
All right. Now, what was there? You have a sense? Were there particular operations that you did that were sort of a larger scale than others? I mean, did you get involved at certain points in sort of brigade level actions, or was it pretty much all company, platoon, battalion stuff?
There were a handful of brigade sweeps. There was one specific battalion sweep that they put us on. I remember that they did not want the enemy to know where we were, so we went quite a few days without any supplies being sent in as we started to go out on this sweep. And we started on that battalion sweep, again, not running into much. I mean, there were many other times before that we would either run into the enemy or villagers hiding in the enemy's bunkers or so on and so forth. But we started on the sweep, and the captain I mentioned to you was a very gung-ho fella. His father, turns out, was a general, was a 3-star general. So he had career in his mind for the military and already had that ingrained in him to a great degree. And he wanted to get firsthand into a battle, not always coming in after a battle and started to try and help out some other group, which is frequently what we had to do. And let me back up, if I may, Jim, because something else just came to mind. One of the larger engagements that we ran into, one company that was the worst of all the companies in running into problems and losing most of their men, ran into a major force in one of their larger patrols. It turns out they ran into a massive hospital complex of the North Vietnamese, extremely massive, of underground hospital rooms and tunnels and everything else. Extraordinary. The company was probably 75% wiped out from the standpoint of wounded or killed. Our company, part of our company, was selected to go in and rescue them in the midst of this massive force. So we finally got in there, in that area, in the dark. We managed to work around what we anticipated. Somehow they knew what the safe, scary way was to get to this stranded company and what was left of it. And we got to them, pulled them all back in, and it was a small area of bamboo and other jungle that we were in. And all of a sudden the word came down, everybody stay quiet, not engage the enemy, don't move. We were a relatively small force, relatively. Turns out, at that point, again, probably 40 to 50 feet and more away from us, the whole complex was being evacuated by the enemy and went by right in front of us. If we had engaged them, we would have all gotten killed because there were so many of them. So they let them go. We pulled, once we sensed they were out, we pulled back with the injured and dead company people, got them back on the perimeter, and that's when the B-52 bomb strike came in of which I was raised off the
Right.
ground because it was so close to us.
Right.
And that was by accident. They had no idea that was there. So that was the first one. The second one was this other battalion sweep, and I hope I'm not taking this too long for
No,
you,
no,
Jim.
no, not at all.
This other battalion sweep, we were on the far edge, the right edge of the battalion, and we'd already been going on it for probably, as I recall, 2 or 3 days. And when we went through an area, our captain told the first sergeant, said, take a squad down over here. I'm not sure what's down in this lower area here to our side that no one else has been through, but let's make sure we have that cleared as we're going through. So we started going through with the rest of the company. This squad happened to run right into a bunker complex of the enemy. And immediately our captain ran off to rescue them, even ahead of our troops. Of course, I had to be with him as a radio operator. And I remember him running so fast and me having all this weight on my body and thinking, what are we doing? But the first sergeant was injured, as well as a few others. And by that time, we'd become a family, in a sense, if you can understand that. The whole company went over, followed the captain. It was the most unorganized focus I've ever seen him have. It was concern for the group he sent over there, and he had a real affinity for the first sergeant, it turns out, who was sent there, I was told later, to make sure he was protected because they saw bigger and better things for him, the bigger commands, all right? As well as the rest of the squad that was attacked. He was concerned about them, but he was real excited about confronting firsthand the enemy. I remember us getting down into that area with the whole company, disorganized organization of chaotic strategic movement. And he identified where the squad was and sent some of the company over to be with them. And at the same time, there was a bunker right in front of where we were at the moment. We'd already started to walk through the bunker complex. I remember even seeing clothes strung out. They didn't know we were there, okay? I remember they just weren't expecting us. And so they had quickly evacuated some of those bunkers, and we started to walk through them without resistance, but ran up to one bunker that was firing quite heavily at us. The captain turned to the group. There was a group of about 6 of us in the command group. Turned to us, he said, I want to take this bunker. And he looked at me, he said, Rich, you take a small group, run and attack this entrance, and there's another side entrance I'm going to go with a couple men at. We got out of a jungle area into what was a clearing just before the bunker, and all of a sudden everything blew. And the fella, it's very interesting, one of the 2 fellows with me was a black fella from New Orleans, it turns out. He saw more in New Orleans than many of us saw in Vietnam. He was a hardened street guy, very hardened. I mean, scars on his face from gang confrontations and all that. I mean, he'd been through it. And he had been put in the command post because he had 2 weeks to go before he was scheduled to leave the country. And they wanted to keep him safe. Vividly, Jim, I remember him turning to me, the strangest look in his eye, and he told me, he said, let's go get him. This was a guy that did not stick his neck out for any other situation up to that point. That was part of what made it so distinctive, along with his being what they called a short timer. And so we proceeded to assault this bunker, and he went out through one trail, and I went through another trail, and this fella, his name was Huey Williams. Matter of fact, it turns out in a visit to the Vietnam Memorial, they have his section of the wall in the Smithsonian. Strangest thing, because the name was there, it just blew us all away. We had to close together, get through the jungle on this trail before we got out in the clearing. And just as we got in the clearing, he got shot in the head and thrown back into me. I proceeded to start to go. The other guy was also shot and killed that was with me. And for some reason, they didn't have a clear shot at me. And bullets started coming down the trail towards me. And I suspect you've heard it before, Jim. It's incredible slow motion of what takes place. And it's almost like boom, 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 boom. And if there can be a funny side to this, I saw the bullets come down the trail. I don't remember training for that, and I thought, this is my mentality of my upbringing. I thought, what would John Wayne do? That's not a joke. That's honestly what I thought. And I thought, get out of the way, stupid. And so I flipped, and of course, it was all happening very quick. And they got a bead on me and shot at my head, knocked off my helmet, and then grazed my head, didn't penetrate my skull. Well, I ended up on my back, my helmet off, and wide open, and I thought, I'm going to pretend I'm dead. It was all instinctive. And the firing stopped within seconds after that. I then got up and ran behind a tree. And I remember the captain being brought by a medic over to me at that tree. How graphic am I supposed to get?
Whatever tells the story, as much as you're willing to do.
His arm was blown in half. And the medic had me hold together his arm while he put what I found out later was a pressure bandage on to get him ready to be medevac. At the same time, he was continuing to give me orders to call in medevac, to call in support troops, to get withdrawal by those that had other wounded and needed to get back to the area, and then further orders to the other sergeants, platoon sergeants, of how to reposition their troops and how to then finish attacking the enemy. It turns out he was in a state of shock. I'm going to jump quite a bit ahead. 1993. I got a call from a sergeant, and he started to back down and finally said, were you in Vietnam with the 1st Air Cav? And long story short, turns out it was a sergeant that I served with, and very closely served with. Mm-hmm. He saw my name in a publication, and out of the lark decided to try and contact me. That was the first contact I'd had. Mm-hmm. And right after that, the captain I served with, his life ended up being spared. Called me up. He was serving in the White House as a drug czar in the 90s under Clinton. He called up, and I was working at the time with Cornerstone University here in Grand Rapids. And they came running back from the switchboard and said, the White House is on the phone. They want to speak to you. And I thought it was a joke or something. They were dead serious. They were stunned. Well, it turned out to be him. And he said, I thought you were killed that day. He doesn't remember me holding his arm together because he was in shock. But his mind was so ingrained with his responsibilities that he popped out the orders left and right. He became the youngest 4-star general to be commissioned. Unreal. His name is Barry McCaffrey.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Brilliant guy. I didn't know back when I hated him in Vietnam when I was a kid, a stupid, snot-nosed kid, how brilliant this guy was. Just extraordinary. Okay, let me back up.
All right.
So we put them together, started to go back, and I remember the medic saying, there's the enemy, shoot him. And I looked around and I said, what enemy, what? Well, he grabbed my rifle and started spraying the bunkers that we were going back to, that were behind us. So we were going back to get the Captain Medevac. It turns out several of our own men had gotten scared and hid in those bunkers. Oh, I so detested them because they weren't helping the situation. So the medevac could not land because it was such thick jungle. They had to hoist him up, but they finally got him out. And then some of the rest of us weren't so drastically injured to be treated by the field hospital at that time. But that was the most distinctive thing. What happened with the rest of the battalion, Jim, I don't know. But in days ensuing, they ran into massive force. They being the company and at least the brigade off the battalion that was in that area that was just the outskirts of the enemy.
All right. Now, how far into your tour was that? Do you have any sense?
That was March 9th. I'll never forget that day of 1969.
Okay, so it's pretty well into it then. You've been out there
Correct.
for some time.
Correct.
Now, you're spending a lot of time out there. Now, you're largely. Did you get breaks? Did you get R&R? Did you get to go out of the combat zone at all?
Not for me up to that point in time. I was due for R&R by virtue of my seniority to get someplace, and I frankly wanted to look at another round-eyed person, and I asked for Australia. Everybody asked for Australia, and so I had to wait until my seniority finally got to me, and I eventually went there after that skirmish. I can't remember when it was, whether it was the end of March or April that I finally got to go there. But that would have been the first break.
All right, but you never got to go back, say, away from the front lines or anything else like that. You were pretty much always in the field.
Always. The only exception to that, right after that intensive skirmish where I was injured and the captain injured and many others killed, I remember one guy is still alive, had his face blown off at point blank range in that whole story. I mean, it was an intense time. And as we found out later, the edge of a huge force. Right after that, I remember our unit was finally given some downtime in a secured area outside of Phuc Vinh. I do remember the name of that town. And I spent a week in the rear. They had stitched me up, and then things finally healed up, and they put me back out in the field. I was so jumpy, Jim. It's not funny. To the point that our own artillery going over our head for way out in the field, I thought was incoming for us. And I remember diving into, it must have been a 6-foot foxhole. It had been there for a while, and I remember hurting my head because I landed on my head. That's the jumpiness I was. And after that, I honestly don't know if I was effective as I was before. Before, I really had it together by virtue of the training, not because I was so good, but by virtue of the training I'm talking about, and acting out what I was supposed to do, listening to orders, handling my responsibilities, and so on and so forth.
Okay. Now, did you continue to serve as company radio operator, or did you do something else after you came
No,
back?
I did. And it was distinctive. And of course, when you become close to someone, like I became close to this captain, even in the short 2 months I was serving with him, the captain that replaced him, I just had trouble finding quite the same level of respect for him. And I'm sure some of it was just because I was so attached to the other man. Not that he was bad, I just became very close to the other captain.
Okay. Now, so basically, over the course of time, that intense experience does sort of take its toll on you. You felt like maybe you weren't as effective later on as you had been for a certain stage there before that. Did you see that in the men around you, or were you not really paying attention?
Yeah, I did. You know, two things stand out. I'm not afraid to say I was scared. I functioned, but it was under fear. I remember distinctive marijuana smell, but the crack of the AK-47 that they primarily used was distinctive. And that crack, when I heard that crack, before I was injured, I mean, I'd had a couple other mortar round incidents. I still got some shrapnel in me, but I mean, the serious injury. Before that time, the crack meant engage. After that time, the crack meant, oh no. It was a different kind of fear. The other was an attack fear. This other was withdrawal fear. Right?
But did you see that kind of thing in the men around you too, if they were out there for long enough?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely, Jim. With the ones I was with.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Another dimension of this, you had mentioned a while back, there were cases where you were near villages and civilians would come out and sell you things and so forth. How much contact, or how much did you actually see of the civilian population? Because you're never in the cities and places like that.
Very little. When we swept in an area that was close to the village, that was a refreshing time. You would get pop sold for ridiculous amounts of money. And I mean, it was all a real treat, and all of a sudden there were real people, and for whatever reason, they put on the front as being very friendly. They of course, having to live in it had to be a different kind of experience for sure. But they were trying to take advantage as much as they could to survive and take advantage of the GIs and all this and that. And they dealt with you at arm's length and yet tried to be warm at the same time, but it was it was a purposeful warmth, not to get close to you, but just to get out of you what they could. All right. So yeah, very infrequently would we do that, be close enough to see the villagers, and that would be a real treat.
So as far as you can tell, the North Vietnamese weren't really using the villages as bases of operations or anything like that?
There were some operations that we got intelligence that they were definitely, especially the Viet Cong, were using villages, and we would sweep through some of these villages, and I recall my experiences when we did that, or even found some villagers hiding in an enemy bunker out someplace as we were doing a search and destroy, treating them with the utmost respect. Totally different than what came to me out of the My Lai incident and the explosiveness of that incident to the people, to where we were all like that. And it just wasn't like that, Jim.
Yeah.
I never experienced, I never heard of it happening. It was a very isolated situation. But unfortunately, the unpopularity of the war, that was a great thing, I think, to take off on and fuel all those negative feelings.
Right. It struck me at some point, if the poster child of World War II was Audie Murphy, the poster child of Vietnam was William Calley. You know,
Yes.
What's the most famous name of a soldier coming out of there? And that could well be it. Yeah.
Interesting, Jim.
Yeah.
Interesting.
All right. Okay. So you had, so you didn't have the same level of contact with the civilian population as some of the people in the rear areas did and all of that kind of stuff. It was just those limited occasions.
When I was injured and I spent some time in the rear, then I became aware of more of the military personnel were in the rear enjoying extraordinary comforts, cots, barbers, and massages, and all this and that going on, security, being scared that they might get a mortar once in a great while. And I'm thinking, what are you talking about? What are you scared for? This is incredibly good. But that was the small majority of us were out in the field, and I thought, oh, that's really not fair. But I also felt proud about it at the same time, and I was ready to do my duty. Strange feeling.
So when you basically, you went to a rear area hospital then after your head injury and that incident. And basically, what was the care like there? Did they take good care of you when you were back there? Or?
Oh yeah, yeah, real good care, and they certainly there was some physical healing, but I'm sure they knew there was mental healing, and let me write some letters home, and that was guarded because I was not married at the time. I didn't want my mother to know I was injured and being that close to death, or even many other times I had been involved in those things. She didn't know any of that stuff. But I was given an opportunity to write, and I wrote a sibling and told him to share it with the others, and things like that. And I was pretty much alone, as I recall. The others remained in the field or were so severely injured they had to go to Japan or other places for work.
Right. Okay. Now, in general, did you communicate much with people at home? Did you write regularly or get letters? Or?
Yeah, yeah. That's one of my fonder memories. When the moon would be full, it was like daylight when you were sitting in a foxhole standing guard, and you'd sit there and write and be able to see easily what you were writing. So I enjoyed that, and I'd frequently get care boxes from home, and had fun with that. And you would cherish the letters that would come out to the field with the supplies. Yeah.
All right. Now, as you got toward the end of your year, were you counting down for how long you had to stay?
Big time. Hugely counting down. And became more and more nervous as the time came closer. Fortunately, we didn't get into major battles or skirmishes to the point that would have been a problem for me. I remember being taken back to a secure area to be ready to be processed out. Within a couple of days, I was on a commercial liner headed back home and thrilled to death.
Okay. Before we kind of pick up with that,
Yes.
you get an R&R to actually go to Australia. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience?
Well, it was, strange as it may sound, a wholesome experience. I stayed in the Sydney area, went with a fellow that I knew in the company, and we determined we were just going to stay together. And we met some girls, and one of them was Oriental, even though he went there to try being with some round-eyed women. She was part of a bigger family that owned a ranch, and they took him back to the ranch, so he got to spend time with the family. The girl I was with was a very wholesome girl. Dumb, naive me, I don't know, maybe there were other things going on, but I just saw the wholesome side. I saw what I wanted to see and experienced what I wanted to experience. Clean, I remember being clean in Sydney. Oh yeah, you experienced some of the animals, so you could say you saw them, and sent back some boomerangs to the family and things like that. But it was a total relaxed time. You stuck out like a sore thumb. People knew you were a GI, big time. Although you tried to put civilian clothes on, it didn't work. With the short haircut and probably the posture and everything else.
All right. And how long did you get to be there?
A week.
Okay. And what was it like having to go back?
Not fun. Matter of fact, when I got back, I was given orders to get on a helicopter to go back to my unit. And I purposely spent another probably 3 days, reluctantly, know what to do. I found some places to sleep, some barracks that weren't occupied, to try and determine what I was going to do. Finally, I sucked it up and got on a helicopter, went out, and they turned the back and said, okay, you're here, we'll let it go. And that's what it amounted to. But I was not wanting to do that.
All right. Are there other particularly significant memories or recollections you've got of that time in the field here that you haven't brought in that you want to add into the story before we take you home? Or do you think you kind of hit the main ones?
Well, I hit some that are standing out in my mind, but there were countless times, some specific dates in December and January, largely when we were rescuing other companies, that we were in the middle of the thick of it, trying to save them. Sometimes it was just to distract the enemy so they could fall back when they were between us and the rest of our company. That were the rest of our battalions, or brigade, battalion. Okay, I'm messing it up here. The rest of our battalion from another company. So we were distracting and yet incredibly close situations of life and death. I mean, just real intense. And discovering even more so on some of the many reunions that I've had since '93, as the general would bring us back together, especially some of the sergeants. I attained the rank of sergeant, obviously move up, being the company RTO, and we would recount things, and almost never one of those battles they mentioned by name the handful of guys that would always hide in the back. And I remember them being reassigned to some of the companies needing to get their group larger again because of casualties, and they becoming casualties because they were useless people. I remember that, and I remember disliking them so much for not pulling together like I thought we all were at the time. Do I remember any other distinctive thing, Jim? Just incredibly hot. I'm a person, even at that time when I was physically fit, I think I was about 150, 160 pounds. I think it was 160. I would carry the most water of the whole company on me. I would carry bladders, 2 gallons full, 2 gallons and the rest 1 gallon. At one point, that one time that we didn't get supplies, I remember there were 5 on my back. I didn't care. I had to have fluid because I sweat so much. But I remember the jungles being so incredibly thick, remember being impatient with the point man and taking over for the point man to start taking my machete and whacking through undergrowth so we'd finally start to move. Very humid. Other than the monsoons up north, it was all very hot and humid weather down below. We one time went through a rubber plantation. We thought we had an enemy group sighted there. Turns out that we didn't encounter them. If there was, they got away. I remember, this is probably the most significant other thing. I remember several times us finally having the enemy, I'll just call them that, on the run. And I can't tell you how many times we were told to stop. We were given orders from back in the rear were not to go any further across the border. I mean, we were so close to taking and destroying the enemy, it's not funny. And then we got into the political games, and that was huge frustration, Jim. Huge frustration. That was so disheartening. But our captain was really good, and he'd regroup us and get us pumped up, and we go try and attack again.
All right. Now, aside from the question of the border, did you have a lot of issues with rules of engagement, or were you mostly in kind of free fire zones where you could fire when you needed to?
Pretty much in free fire zones.
Because the DMZ is pretty much like that because there's no civilians up there.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
But and then at least away outside of those villages anyway.
I'm definitely talking down by the by Saigon, by the Cambodian border. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah. Okay. So
Except a couple times we went through villages, we were told to be very careful.
Right.
At those times, and fortunately we didn't engage the enemy, at least when we recognized as enemy, and treated the others totally respectful, including the property and everything else.
Right. Okay. Now, over the course of that year, especially as you got toward the last couple of months of it after your captain had been hurt, did you think at all about whether or not you were getting anywhere or making progress? Did you feel like you were kind of accomplishing things, or was it just continuing kind of a treadmill?
I felt like I was spinning wheels at that point in time, and I didn't see any purpose to what we were doing other than pure survival, totally. And the impetus to be aggressive against the enemy was gone at that point in time.
All right. So finally, you do get your chance to go. You get to go home now. They've pulled you out of the rear. How do they get you back to the States?
With commercial jet, I think it was American Airlines, or was it TWA may have been at that time. Stripped down, very basic version, hardly, didn't have anything to eat. There were stewardesses, commercial airline stewardesses there, but they had extremely little contact with us. But we were ecstatic to go home, so we didn't care about anything other than being an extremely long flight. That's how we got back. And I was flown into, oh my, I think I was flown back to California. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was California. I flew back to, and then got on a military flight, and ended up back in, then ultimately in Gary, but I can't remember how I got there.
Okay. Now, did you go home in uniform, or did you switch to civilian clothing along the way somewhere?
Well, this is an area that's probably the most difficult, other than some of the traumatic things that I experienced in the war, was the experience when I got home. And I remember the plane landing in California, and I looked out the window and thought, well, where are the people going to be that are welcoming us home? Got off the plane, went through the terminal. Didn't have anybody spit on me, but I had people walking over to the other side of the corridor to stay away from me. I thought, well, what's going on here? Then, stupid old me, because all I had over there was the military communications of one sort or another. And then, of course, they were always going to talk up the right stuff. Mm-hmm. Then I realized that not only was the war hated, but we were hated. I've never forgiven. That may sound too strong, but I don't know if I've forgiven the people for that. That's been the most disturbing thing. I'm not able to show much emotion. I'm having trouble dealing with that. But what will bring me closest to tears is welcoming other current war veterans home. And I don't begrudge them that. Mm-hmm. That's not where I'm coming from. But what I didn't get, and then found out it was much more widespread. That general, mm-hmm. captain became general,
right.
He got spit on in the face. Matter of fact, he wrote a couple books, and that's my claim to fame. I was in the books. Mm-hmm. He related that after he returned, he was spit in the face when his wife were walking into a government mm-hmm. building. It just really threw him off. But that's probably the most difficult thing, as dumb as it sounds. Almost ahead of the war trauma, all right?
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, you get yourself back home, finally. What do you do then once you get back to Gary?
They gave me 30 days. And, of course, the immediate family, great, you're home, and we'll honor you, but I never felt it. Didn't feel it. I felt it was forced more than anything. It was just because of love of me as part
right.
of the family,
right.
that sort of thing. And nothing distinctive about the 30 days. I was assigned to D.C. from there to go, according to my orders, to the Honor Guard. I thought, oh, that's nice. Nice little finish of my 6 months is what it was. Mm-hmm. And I got there, and they said, here, you have to re-up for 2 years. I said, what are you talking about? They said, the training is 6 months alone for what you'll have to do. I said, I'm not re-upping for nothing. I said, I don't want to stay in this Army any longer than I have to. So they made me a drill sergeant at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, of all things. And so that's how I finished out my time, being able to dish out to the new troops what I had to take. So I put on the hat of drill sergeant, and I unfortunately played it up to the hilt. But with the design in mind that I knew many of them were going to face potentially dangerous situations, and I was intent on them being ready for that.
Did you tell them much of anything about Vietnam, or did you just not do that because that's not what a drill sergeant does?
No, we did not. I remember putting on a demeanor of a true drill sergeant and being a real jerk, is what it is, to the point that some of the recruits could have mopped up the floor with me, and through a number of situations they were told by another sergeant to take me out. And I remember them saying, no, he's crazy. So my role was fulfilled. They listened to everything I did from day one. But at the end of the cycle, I always treated them right too. Once they finally finished accomplishing what they were supposed to in that basic training. I remember that.
All right. And then now having finally, you get your discharge now, you made it early, 1970 by then. What do you do in terms of picking up your life at that point?
Well, I remember going back and knowing I had to get a job. When I left the Army, I wanted to leave the Army and any connection I had with it in Vietnam behind me, because I became painfully aware of the feelings about that whole situation. Didn't understand them fully because I've been taught like, this is right, they're wrong, take care of them, this aggression, da, 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 da. And then hearing we were all wet, and so it was very confusing. So I thought, further, the distaste that I experienced with Vietnam War and all that were in it together, I didn't want people to know. So I just stayed away from that subject and led my life like that was never a part of my life, to the extreme.
Now, did you go back to school or just start work?
Yeah. Well, I started work and had some great experiences at work. Ended up going back at age 35 to get a college degree with a family, full-time job. Not the best way to do it, but all of a sudden that finally became beneficial to me. It became fun to do. Oh, it was a huge struggle, but it was an enormous satisfaction of the accomplishment because I was ready to interact and all. Of course, being a little older, I could relate different things, even though I felt quite funny with a largely standard college crowd, like they were looking like, what are you doing here, old man? But you could relate to the professor in much more of a life experience way, and that made it rich time.
And where did you go to college?
Toledo University, as a matter of fact.
Okay. And what kind of work had you been doing before you went to college?
Worked with the phone company. I became district manager in 4 states over motels with Howard Johnson Company back in their heyday in the 70s, all right? And through a variety of things that occurred, I was going into college work, but I was redirected to be the business manager, administrator, I think is what they called me, of an extremely large church and Christian school in Toledo in 1982. They had a staff of 8 guys, and they needed somebody to head up their finances, their maintenance, their printers, their computers, the school, all the personnel, the human resources type thing, and all this and that. so the pastors could do their functions in a spiritual way. And so I guess it sounds like I did the unspiritual part, huh? And so I did that for 8 years, and I was invited to Cornerstone University in 1990 and came here to Grand Rapids for that. As director of estate planning, totally different field that I've been in. So.
Right. And then do you also have a connection with the Salvation Army, was it? Or?
Now I'm with the Salvation Army, doing essentially that work. They've given me the title of Plan Giving Director of the Division, Western Michigan and Northern Indiana Division. And it's essentially estate planning work, but it's raising deferred funds for the Salvation Army.
Right.
Is what it is, Jim.
Okay. And you wound up working for various religious organizations or institutions. Was sort of faith or spirituality, was that part of your life back when you were out there in Vietnam? Was that?
Absolutely not. It was interesting. When that grenade came to me, came through the air, then started rolling on the ground. I remember the machine gunner flying off to the side out of the way. Me rolling over behind the stump. I rolled back over and I thought, okay, I went to church when I was young. My mother always took me there. My father died when I was about 9 years old, and my mother raised me the rest of the way. And she always took me to a church, and I thought, okay, I know there's a God. I'm just going to pray to him. But Jim, as soon as I started to pray, I stopped because I thought, I don't know God. I went through all of Vietnam without any direct relationship, if you would call it that, with God. But an unbelievable peace, and that it's strange in one sense, but I felt comfortable. And as I said, I've got a grenade wound, I got a shrapnel wounds, I still got some shrapnel in me. I remember recruits saying in one firefight, said, "Boy, you were dynamic. We never would have made it without your being so solid and such under fire." I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" We were off on the flank of one firefight. There was some enemy behind us that we didn't know about, and their tracers were white. Tracers were coming right over my head, but I didn't know it. I never told them. I had no idea. I made them think I was really good, really tough. But through all those things, many very close encounters, and obviously being shot in the head just another inch, and I wouldn't be here talking with you, I know. Extraordinary situations. I went through all that without a faith, one that I could identify. Okay.
All right. Now, if you kind of look back over that whole experience in the military, I mean, you've addressed parts of this already, but how would you say all of that affected you or changed you? Were you different at all when you came out, or did you know more when you came out than when you went in?
No more about what?
Well, either yourself or the world around you on the one hand.
Right.
Or do you think you were all a different person than you were when you went in?
I think through at least the early 90s, I did a magnificent job of compartmentalizing everything up to that point in time. And I had a compartment of my association with the war and all that it did to me, and I locked the door and kept it in that little corner of my mind, okay? And so I function as a normal person, if you call normal, productive person, let me put it that way, in society. Established a family, had a good group of friends, I was doing good work, both in a secular environment as well as a full-time Christian vocational environment. Felt very satisfied. until I was discovered in the early 90s. And it frankly has been very hard, okay, since then till now. A lot of things have come back, and I'm still having trouble dealing with them, okay?
All right.
All of a sudden that door got unlocked, and I don't know who got the key to unlock it, but it's not been a fun ride, okay? In the sense that during the time I was able to lock that door, and people that were close to me found out I was a drill sergeant and said, you're not the kind of guy that could ever be a drill sergeant. They couldn't picture me. So that was the way I was coming across to them. And the last few years has been real hard relationally with people. I'm still married. It didn't cause a divorce. It certainly caused pressures. My wife didn't understand and doesn't to this day. Not fully. She accepts some things, but she doesn't understand. And I'm not faulting her for that. She just can't. And I've had a couple of reunions, many ones in southern Michigan with some of the guys I served with. I've had a couple larger ones in Washington, D.C., including a reunion, initial reunion with that general, which is, of course, emotional by itself, although I didn't show it. It was inside very emotional. And coming up to those reunions, I dreaded them, going to them, to the point that I would even be late for the start time of those reunions. And yet after I went to them, I felt encouraged because I got to share with other guys that went through some of the same garbage. And you hear all sorts of different stories, and of course some of them, it's everybody's perspective, so you got to take it all with a grain of salt. But I still struggle hugely with them. I just missed one in July. I'm going to miss one in D.C. probably in November because I just can't face up to it. The general has invited me to. He still has great connections, and we get to go to the Vietnam ceremony. This is around Veterans Day. It's a Vietnam Wall ceremony, and we get special front row seats and recognized. And we've been to the wreath laying ceremony by the president. I mean, he really treats us upright and all that. But in spite of all that good stuff, it just really still hard to deal with. Right.
Yeah. Well, given that, then, I think I'd just like to close out here by thanking you for taking the time to come and tell me your story, because you've done a good job, and there's a lot here that people are going to learn from. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it.
I can just switch off. On the chair.
Question, I thought, oh, it's on.